And I should say, Peter, I've just spent 3 or 4 days in Tasmania, and I've come to the view that as Australia, like the rest of the world, changes, perhaps the only 2 places in Australia that have really good points of difference are Tasmania with its greenery and its hills and driving along next to the water and so forth, and Northern Australia. Whether it's Melbourne or Sydney or Perth, all of the cities are increasingly coming together as one. They all sell the same sorts of products, they've all got the same problems with transport, etc., etc. So we're lucky in this country that's as diverse as ours, that we have still areas that I think will increasingly draw the attention of the rest of the world to places that are as natural as they were so many years ago. And then you have the regional and rural towns such as Bendigo that still has its architecture in place. And you might ask, therefore, how does that all reflect on this issue of disruption? And I guess if you just quickly look back over the last 20 years, already disruption was with us well before COVID hit. And whether that was disruption in the way in which governments operated, whether it was disruption in the demand for labour and the quality, particularly in municipal councils, of people with good experiences and normal promotion lines that used to exist in years gone by, or whether it was disruptions in terms of social welfare, the way in which the media works, disruption was well in place. And I think the only thing we can be sure of, and I look back over my obviously very short lifetime, but the speed of change is not going to slow, it's only going to accelerate. And so when you and I, we use these new devices, whether they be phones, computers, etc., our children, if I want advice, I don't talk to anyone of my own age group anymore, I talk to my grandchildren, and they can use devices in ways that I never knew imaginable. So the speed of change is only going to accelerate. And it's not just in the way that new ideas are presented, it's the way in which communities react one to the other. And I suppose over the last few years we've seen an increasing focus on social issues that have a ramification on community as a whole. So if you just have a look at Australia in the last 20 years, perhaps the 2 most extraordinary changes that have taken place socially has been the referendum on same-sex marriage, which you would have thought would have been rejected by a lot of people in rural Australia, and yet rural Australia overwhelmingly voted for that referendum. You've seen the introduction of the National Disability Insurance Scheme, which recognises those people with disabilities, and particularly the carers who often sacrifice their whole lives to look after a person with a disability. These might be seen by many people to be minor issues, but the ramifications of them, I think, are quite extraordinary. And more recently, you're seeing this increasing focus on the relationship between men and women and the way in which we respect each gender, and how we are increasingly bringing to a public focus issues of abuse, etc. Now, all of that, both those 3 aspects of life, were not even part of Australian life in real terms going back before the turn of the century. They are social changes. The one major social change we haven't come to grips with yet, which I suspect we will over the next few years, is that of better recognising our Indigenous peoples, who have been with us and may be the first civilisation in the world, and yet we still have difficulty in coming to grips with respecting their culture. And we continue to focus on areas of abuse or failure within their communities rather than the very large areas of success, etc., etc. So those are the sorts of social changes that have taken place, and as I've indicated, maybe one that we've still got to undertake. Social. I think what COVID has done is accelerate the rate of change and therefore disruption in a way none of us have ever experienced. So I'm obviously a child of the first half of the last century. I've served in the military, I've served overseas, I've got some understanding of what conflict means, physical conflict. We want to avoid it for the rest of time, we can't be certain about that, but we do know that in the environment in which we now live, we are a country of only 25 million people. We are the anchor point of Asia. Immediately to our north, there are 4 billion people, and we're seeing some stirrings, particularly out of China, where we can't predict what the future is actually going to hold. And so when I look and try and reposition myself today, 20 years from now, I say, well, what are the things that are likely to disrupt us in a way that COVID has clearly disrupted us? And COVID has had its good aspects and it's had its bad aspects. Certainly there's probably 80% of the community and businesses, maybe 75% that have come through this fairly well. On the other hand, 20 or 25% of the community have had a diabolical experience, and many businesses have been lost, and many businesses aren't going to reopen, and many people who have worked their lifetime to build up their assets have seen those assets destroyed. We can't change what's happened. We can learn from COVID in case there'll be another pandemic, and I suggest there probably will at some stage in the future, and that is if we can manage our way through this one as well as we're doing at the moment. But again, you've got to, from our point of view and your point of view as individuals in your industry, try to anticipate what the future is going to hold from the lessons that we've learned. So one of the lessons that I am very clear about is nothing stands still, and that disruption is going to occur, and therefore I keep coming back to this major point about our geographic location in part of the world in which we live. And we don't have, as a country, yet the policies that are going to secure us, I think, economically within the region. And by that I mean, for instance, if you ask me, or if I was to ask you, where you think Australia might be in terms of our relationship with those to our north, those 4 billion people in 10, 20 years' time, I wonder what your response would be. If I was to ask you, do we have a national water policy? Do we have a national agricultural policy? Do we have a concept of saying, in 10, 20 years' time, we want to be able to feed 1 billion of those people to our north? So they have a dependency upon us and our production and the people we employ to produce. We have this land mass. We don't have a national water policy. We don't have a national agriculture policy. And I've always said we should have an objective of, as I've just said, being able to feed 1 billion of those people in the years to come, because all of those countries to our north now are net importers of food. And yet Israel and New Zealand have a higher reputation in supplying food as required to those countries to our north. How does that affect you and your municipalities and community as a whole? Very simply, because if we have policies that lead to growth, employment growth in particular, then we're all going to benefit. And we don't have that in place at the moment. We keep doing things for today rather than doing things long term. So I think in terms of disruption, we've got to think more clearly about where we want to be in our region, first of all. Secondly, in terms of disruption, what does it mean for the relationship between federal, state and local governments? Of course, the debate has been going ever since Federation that we're over-governed, and there's no doubt that we are. And perhaps, with due respect, Tasmania has more government officials than any other state, and with a smaller population. But it's so inefficient, and it's increasingly inefficient, where you see overlaps occurring and duplication, and whether the country ever has the capacity to address that. So for those of you who might be from South Australia, Tasmania or Victoria, one of my better thought proposals, but was not accepted by everyone else in the community some years ago, was that we should actually have a southeastern corner administration of Australia, where you bring together South Australia, Victoria and Tasmania. You keep your identity, your face to market in terms of those border areas, but you only have one police department, you only have one health department, you only have one planning department, etc. So we've now got, of course, in each of those sovereign states, massive bureaucracies where there is duplication and waste, and we're no longer efficient in terms of the way in which we deliver public service. We're not as efficient as we could be in delivering public services to the community as a whole. Some years ago, we reduced the number of councils in Victoria quite considerably, from about 211 down to about 73 or 4, and successive governments have only made one change in that period of time. The question is whether that number of councils is any longer the best solution for the next 10, 20 years, or whether there should be some continuing refinement. One of the things that worries me in terms of disruption is to the workforce that currently occurs within councils. And I say that, and I guess it's why I was invited here today, in part because of my role with CT management, and we deal with councils throughout the eastern states in particular, and I'm very, very concerned at the diminishing quality among so many of the CEOs within municipalities, the rate of change that is occurring within the CEOs, the lack of consistency in policies. And I've got to say, even the concept with engineering. In days gone by, the engineer of a council was a senior person with a great deal of experience. And when we don't have that same experience consistently applied in your areas of work, and where's that going to take us over the next few years, when in fact communities are demanding more and more, councils, being councillors in the main, give in to the bleatings of the community to the point that so much of their revenue is taken up with areas that in the past were never dealt with by councils. Now that is not to say some of those areas should not continue to be supplied, but should we continue with all of those other activities at the cost of providing the basic services that councils provide. So when I look at disruption, I see disruption in municipalities in levels of government occurring from many corners. It's occurring from governments themselves, changing regulations, changing acts, and that's just happened here again in Victoria, and I can't speak for the rest of the country. I look at the quality of people within local government service. I look at what I see as a diminution of the respect community has for those working within municipalities. So in years gone by, it was an industry that was highly respected. I'm not sure it has that respect today, and I'm not sure the industry, being the councils, actually do themselves a service in promoting that people can have very good careers within municipalities in terms of the administrative side. So where's this going to lead? And certainly when you have a look now as a result of COVID, the increase in levels of debt held by state governments and the federal government. We've never encountered this level of debt before. And I can't clearly identify the impact that that's going to have in the years to come. Suffice to say, when interest rates start to rise again, as they will, and hopefully not for a year or two, but when they start, the way in which governments respond to that increased cost of servicing those debts will mean that they'll have to either cut back services or they'll make demands on other tiers of government. And the one area that continually gets hit is local government. So there's a likelihood that local government might find itself being continually squeezed. What does that mean? It means that things that local government should be providing, an engineer should be providing, things like infrastructure either don't get maintained or they don't get constructed. and then we find ourselves in an awful catch-up situation. So to me, if ever there was a time for people to be able to clearly articulate not a vision or a plan that we can all work to, that takes on board what we have experienced. We take on disruption as we know it today, and we try and identify what is going to be the best for communities 10 years from now, 20 years from now. It's not to say we're going to be right all of the time in what we identify, but there needs to be a plan. And what has happened because of COVID, so many of those plans, if there were any, or preparation of those plans, have either been put to one side or they haven't been drawn up. So we're living day to day, mouth to mouth. And it's not going to serve us well, simply because we are going to come out of this. There is going to be and has been this disruption. And the question is the implications of that disruption and the cost of that disruption to every tier of government and therefore the community. And if I can just say that the thing that worries me as much as that, if you bring that down to families, so many in our community now are purchasing houses, etc., etc. Many of our young think money is free. The interest rates are so low, it is developing in one sense a false sense of economy. And for those of you who've got a bit of grey hair on top of your head, or any hair, whatever the case may be, we remember when interest rates were a lot higher, 17%. We remember when interest rates were 8 and 9%, which has always been about the average. Money is never free. And if interest rates start going up in 2 or 3 years, 3 or 4 points, 5 points, there is going to be another layer of disruption among those who have got access to assets today, which they're just not going to be able to meet. And so, hopefully, we're coming out of COVID with a new set of criteria, a new set of balance sheets, in a world in which we are a large continent with very few people, and yet we still have developed a level of complacency that is at our cost, because it is not bringing about the development of Australia, its people, its employment, for what I consider the immediate future. And that makes us vulnerable, as my wife would say. We should never be fearful, but the reality is, had the Japanese, for instance, Second World War, just continued their push through Darwin into Australia, we have no defence. We would have fallen. We have no defence now, in real terms. So from a military point of view, we could never defend Australia. Our total armed forces personnel numbers about 55,000. That's half the MCG full. If we all went down to Tasmania, we couldn't defend Tasmania. So there is no security for the country from a military point of view. The only thing that will keep us safe, secure, that we can pass on the democratic ways that we enjoy to future generations is if we are economically and socially strong. And you can't be economically and socially strong unless you have a plan that you work on as a community that keeps delivering over time. So I come back and I just touch again on water and agriculture. We have no plan there. And yet we could employ scientists, we could employ skilled, semi-skilled and unskilled labour in becoming a major producer by shipping water all over the country to both give us certainty, continuity on those lands that produce agricultural products now, and to open up some of our arid land. We don't have an idea, for instance, as how our communities are going to be governed 10, 20 years from now, to actually make sure that the efficiencies that we should all be striving for are actually delivered. And as social change is taking place, invariably the demands grow. And that leads the politicians to respond to demand in order to be re-elected, rather than necessarily make from time to time the hard decisions that are necessary to ensure community growth. So as you gather here today, I don't mean in any way to be pessimistic. My whole nature is one of optimism. But I have in my lifetime experienced a lot of change. As I said right at the beginning, I've never seen change occurring as quickly as it's occurring at the moment. And the only thing I can learn from the past is if I don't know where I'm going or where I'm trying to get to, then I'm going to be blown apart by the speed of change. If you apply that to a municipality, if you apply it to a state, if you apply it to Australia, you've got to have some understanding of where we want to be as a continent in 10, 20 years' time. And no one has outlined that vision or that plan to the point that I can honestly say to you in answer to the question, what do our governments want and where do they want us to be in 10 or 20 years' time? I'd be very surprised and interested if any of you thought you could answer that question. And I think that if a country doesn't know where it's going, if a country doesn't have a plan, you can't be surprised if our children don't have a plan, and if our children don't live day to day. So you've, as Peter said, you have a lot of speakers here from various disciplines, one from overseas, and I guess at the end of your conference you ought to be asking yourselves, out of all of this discussion, as you talk among yourselves, what can you take away from here that makes sense, that might make a difference to your particular profession and to your areas of employment, and perhaps even to your own families? And I want to touch on that because I think that has been part of my occupation over the last 10, 20 years or so. If people don't have some idea of where they're going, then you see more and more of us suffering stress and anxieties, which unresolved can often lead to serious illnesses. It saddens me beyond words almost that every day 8 Australians take their lives, young through to senior men in particular. 8 a day, over 3,000 a year. We call ourselves the lucky country, but increasingly people are opting out because of the stresses and anxieties they face. In part that's because they don't have the answers to how they're going to get through their life as a family, how they're going to get through their life as a community. And on a broader scale, because they think there are pressures being imposed, financial or economic, upon their businesses, etc. One of the most important social changes over recent years, as I said, has been the introduction of the National Disability Scheme. I think what has also been important has been the way in which we are able now to look at mental illness in a different way than we have in the past. We encourage people to come forward and to seek help when in need. And there'll be many in this room who have suffered anxiety and stress, some still doing so, but the important thing is if you can't solve that issue yourself, to get help, because if you don't and can't get yourself in a good place, you can't deliver the leadership or the responsibilities that you'd like to your family or to your workplace or any other part of the community. And as we continue to go through this period of disruption, those stresses and those anxieties are likely to build unless we have an idea of where we want to get to and how we're going to do it. So we sit here today 2021, having been through an extraordinary year, we've seen the way people, you walk down shopping centres, you see vacant shops, you see shops for lease. People are now buying online. That's only going to accelerate. A lot of these small independent operators are not going to be there. What are they going to do? We're seeing disruption on a scale never experienced before. And what's the missing ingredient in all of that? It is a plan. It is a plan for the individual, it's a plan for the family, it's a plan for the local government, it's a plan for the state, and it's a plan for the country. People are not buying into things with confidence because we live on a day-to-day basis. So, as I say, I am an optimist, but the one thing I would like to see as we come out of this period of disruption into the next period of disruption is an understanding better of where we want to get to. Because otherwise we're all going to be just marching up and down on the same spot. I suppose I use the analogy, and I'm fortunately involved in a whole range of areas, whether it's commercial, whether it's local government, whether it's sport with Hawthorn, whether it's not-for-profit where I deal with work with Indigenous people who are incarcerated. I see a whole lot of areas of life which are fulfilling in one sense, but are unconnected. And I've witnessed over the last probably 10, 15 years, a growing divide between people who have been highly successful, who are very, very wealthy, and what I would call those of us who are neither very wealthy nor very poor, but who are getting continually squeezed. And so those who unfortunately are at the bottom of the economic ladder, who rely simply almost on welfare to survive, don't worry about them buying houses, etc. Whatever they get, they use on fundamentals. But there is this growing divide in society between the very wealthy, whom we read about the whole time and who are promoted for their successes, which is good, but for the rest of society who are just trying to meet and make their budgets work, whether that's individually or whether it's at local government or increasingly, hopefully, one day state and federal governments. And it worries me about where that is going to end up if in fact we don't develop and come out of this period of disruption with a vision for the future. So all of my experiences, as I said, whether it's sport, and I've seen what disruption has done to sport, we lower our costs and we can't play around the country. I see it in the charities that I'm involved in. There is this, we're holding our breath still. We're doing the best we can. We're running as fast as we can, but we're running underwater. We're just trying to keep our heads above water until we feel confident, I think, that we know what we're actually running for. I just want to conclude, and then, if you're happy, throw it open to questions, answers and abuse, whichever comes naturally to you. I'm very used to abuse and enjoy it thoroughly. If you'd asked me 20 years ago what was the most important thing in my life, I probably would have responded and said, my wife and my family. If you ask me what's the most important thing in my life now, I would say my own health. What I've learned after years with Beyond Blue and moving around the community, and every week I still get people ringing up who are desperately in need of psychiatric or psychological support, or have been involved in a suicide within the family. What I've come to realise, if I'm not in as good a place as possible, mentally and physically, I can't discharge my duties, whatever they may be, whether it's to a sporting club or whether it's to a not-for-profit or whether it's to any of the commercial organisations I'm involved in. I would like you to think over the next 2 days, how do you value your own health, mentally and physically? And what priority do you give it in terms of making sure that you maintain the highest levels of mental and physical good health? To the point that I say to people, don't retire. To me, if you put your hand up and looking forward to retirement, you're really signing your own death warrant. Once you decide to give up, you're saying that you're going to look forward to that period of time when you're sitting there being served pureed food. You're going to be worried about your own illnesses, scratches and aches and pains, and your whole focus shrinks. And when we start shrinking our mental capacity to self or to things that are lesser, you can't communicate with other people. How often do we see senior citizens and you ask, how are you, which is the most stupid question to bloody ask. They tell you it's always about their urinary infections, or it's always about their pureed food. Retirement equates with death, so we've got to commit ourselves to a long life, and whether we live for 20 years or 100 years makes no difference. It's a very short life. The best way we can live is to make sure that we're mentally and physically fit, and that we go to bed every night tired, so that we sleep well. So to those people who think of giving up their full-time job as a politician or as an engineer, I say to them, well, go from 5 days a week, go down to 1 or 2 working for money if you wish, for financial reasons. Make sure you spend 1 day in the garden, 1 day looking after grandchildren, 1 day playing sport. Doesn't matter, but every day's got to be full. And I think this builds up a resilience within the individual. And it also gives you the opportunity to provide whatever it is you provide, love, affection, warmth, intellectual capacity, to those you're responsible for in a much better way. So I look at a lot of people in industry today and you see the leaders, they're not enthusiastic, they're not optimistic, and that flows through the workplace very, very quickly. You actually need people who are fit and well to lead so that they can encourage those around them to also get to that good place. So at the end of this you ask yourself, righto, we've heard 8 speakers, we've heard different experiences, we've learnt a little bit here and there, but in the end of all of that, it all comes down to you, it all comes down to me. That is not selfish, that is actually being responsible. How do I do my job better? I've got to be fit, mentally and physically. How do I look after my family better? I've got to be mentally and physically fit. We can learn from experience. The one thing we continually are complacent about is our own condition. It's not selfish to be putting your condition as your first priority. It is absolutely essential. As I say, we've never had the sorts of experiences we've had over the last year. Whether that's repeated, time will tell. Whether something worse comes along, I don't know. But I do know that the only way we're dealing with and growing successfully is to plan. And I wonder when you speak and listen today, tomorrow to those who are addressing you, I wonder how many of them are actually talking about 10 years from now. I wonder how many of them actually bring your thoughts back to your own condition. Because to me, they're the 2 most important ingredients in actually living a wholesome life. Wanting to know where you are, but knowing that you're in the best place to live however many years we have. So, interesting times. As I said, I'm not a pessimist at all, I'm very much an optimist. I love life, I want to live a long time. I've said to my family I'm going to live to 150. That will probably mean I'm going to look like a bit of a fried egg, just flat, and the little yolk will be bouncing up and down. But you've got to believe that we're going to live a long time, and if we're going to live a long time, we want to live as well as we can. So I wish you well with your discussions, your information, sharing of experiences. I think the next 5 years are going to be very, very exciting. And I think they're going to be very exciting because I don't know what's going to happen. And I don't think any of us can actually predict with any certainty what's going to happen and how people are going to respond. The one thing we should all be articulating and asking for is the development of those plans. So even within councils, even though governments are asking for, better work on infrastructure, asset planning, all of those sorts of things, we've actually got to make sure that when we make those demands, we have the revenue coming in to meet them. We've got to be more realistic. Sadly, we don't make great change in this country until we're put under great pressure or until we're in conflict or things of that nature. We don't want conflict, but we do have to understand it's better to work in advance of there being a major disruption simply because we haven't had the courage to provide the leadership that's required. I think I'll leave it at that. I'll throw it open to questions and answers for a few moments. Have we still got a bit of time?
Yeah, we sure have, Jeff. But before we go on to the questions, could we just put our hands together? Thank you.
No, don't worry about your hands. So, very happy to take questions, comments, abuse, whichever you like. Who's first? Yes, sir, over here. Get you a microphone.
Thanks for that, Mr. Kennett. I'm after a bit of your optimism because the biggest change and disruption for me for the last 5 years has seen Hawthorn drop down the ladder. We're not winning flags anymore and we're not improving, so can you give me a bit of your enthusiasm and optimism with the Hawks, please?
Well, this is a fundamental question. I've got to say, you're one of my 63,000 members at the moment and are all terribly, terribly lost. It's been 5 years since we've won a premiership, and they're angry, and they're lonely, and they're stressed. We will have a better year this year, but can I just say, I was at an AFL conference yesterday with all the other presidents, and they're all equally as confident. So you're going to find 18 teams win the premiership this year, in which will be one of the most unusual disruptive years we've ever had. Suffice to say, it's interesting. The AFL has 18 clubs. Only 6 of them are financially independent. That is, they're financially strong enough to live on their own resources apart from what the AFL distributes in terms of player payments. 12 of them, that's 2/3 of the competition, require financial support just to open their doors. So this lovely competition, which we all like very much, it's in a tough place. Not just because of COVID, they were in a tough place before. And the question is, hopefully, if we have a good year this year, by that I mean crowds back to games and we're not in hubs, then we'll start to improve our strength a bit. But there's only 6 clubs at the moment that can survive financially without AFL support. We're in a good position, but if we had a bad year, we could see ourselves fall into that dependent state. There's only one club in the AFL that is really very wealthy, and that's West Coast. That has huge amounts of money because they live in an environment where there's a lot of support from the community. So they're the lead team. Hawthorn and 5 others are below them, and then there's 12 below the line. Yes, anyone from Melbourne, St Kilda want to say anything? Yes, over here.
Just back in the 1992s to you were Premier for 7 years, the selling of the TAB, the electricity. Well, I can never understand. These are things that would make the state a lot of money that you sold, Jeff.
Well, the TAB technically.
Electricity sort of.
Yep.
Like that, yeah.
The TAB was an industry government should not be in. Like a lot of councils, technically you shouldn't be in areas that the private sector provide. You shouldn't be providing golf courses and all these sorts of things that you've come to provide over the years. You should be making sure that your infrastructure's there, your bridges and your roads, and they're your priorities. That's what people technically pay for. So I have no qualms about the TAB going. As I was driving up this morning, I had a driver, so I don't want you to think I was reading while I was driving. But I was reading the financial papers, and you'll have seen that there's the company that owns your lawn is going to close down those power stations in, I think, 2028 as opposed to 2032. And that's partly because we've now moved, or are moving, from coal-based electricity, which I think is on its own quite dangerous because we won't have the underlying capacity, but anyway, that's the way it's going, to solar and other means. If we still own them, if the state still owned them, as we move from coal to solar and wind, we'd get no money for those assets at all. It might seem a little strange to you now, but when we sold those assets in the 90s, the electricity, etc., we sold them because we, at that stage, had a massive state debt. We didn't have the money to maintain them, to maintain the power lines, etc. So we sold it to private enterprise for them to invest. It's strange now, almost 25 years later, that that decision, which was made for the right reasons, but also generated a lot of money for us, which we used to reduce our debt, almost wipe it out. If we'd kept those assets, right now we'd be like that company that's privately owned, who's going to have to write off those assets for nothing. So we didn't sell it because we knew then that solar or wind was going to become the alternative power. We didn't know. But had we retained it, and had governments moved to solar, wind, etc., we'd have got nothing for those assets. And the debt that we had then, that was left to us by former governments, would have exponentially grown. And then if you have a look at the debt that's been added to in the last 5 years, Victoria has a debt of $180 billion now. We left office with $5 billion. It's going to be 180, and it's going to be higher than Queensland's. Now, all right, we privatised because we wanted to focus on the things that government should provide, and we privatised because we couldn't afford to maintain those assets to provide what those assets provided. So I have no qualms whatsoever. Right? It was carefully thought out. It wasn't some ideological issue. And yet, by way of contrast, the successive governments, even the current government in Victoria, is continuing to sell our assets, whether it's the ports, whether it's some of our registry offices. You will have seen the other day they're about to privatise Vic Roads. They say it's just a partnership, but that's just another name. Right? We didn't get rid of Vic Roads, funnily enough, because Vic Roads in those days, led by some of the most wonderful people, was fundamentally an engineering-based organisation, right? And you could rely on those engineers to actually develop the infrastructure we needed on the ground. So we kept it. Well, it's about to go. Thank you for your question.
I'm a Carlton fan all the way.
Well, I can tell. Who's next? Yes, over here.
What's your thoughts about the Nelson Road initiative?
Well, I don't like it, and I'm not saying that politically. A state government doesn't have the responsibility, or in my opinion, the right to enter into contracts with another sovereign government. If Australia wants to enter into those, it should be Australian. That involves us all. What worries me about Belcher Road, so there's been, if you have a look at all our major infrastructure at the moment, and most of those firms who are competing for that infrastructure work are all in the main owned by the Chinese. So even John Holland, which is an old Australian company, is owned by the Chinese. And we're finding Chinese companies are competing against Australian companies for all our major infrastructure work. And they're coming in, and they're coming in at very low prices in order to win the work. And if we ever get in a situation, as many other sovereign countries have, that are parts of that Belt and Roads program, you lose control of the asset. Right? So, again, I'm not anti-Chinese, don't get me wrong, but we are losing out to people who are competitively competing at prices that our people cannot afford. So if you have a look at all the tunnelling equipment that is being used for all this infrastructure, where's it all coming from? Only one place. So again, I don't want you to think that I'm not anti-China, but I think the balance here in Victoria has tipped too much into one pot, and that worries me tremendously. And not one of those major projects are being completed on time and on budget. So every time they get into trouble, they put more pressure on the government, and the government simply surrenders and pays more. So when we built CityLink, it was where Transurban started. It was the consortium that became Transurban. It was finished on time and on budget. I think it was $1 billion. Well, you know the cost of road construction these days. It is very, very expensive. So it worries me tremendously. What worries me more than the title of the program is what we're all going to inherit in Victoria as a result of that reliance on one source of income that funds all this major infrastructure and then actually provides the equipment as well. Again, I can't predict what the future holds. It's not the way I would have done it, and I certainly wouldn't have extended to Transurban the franchise right to extend the tolling on CityLink. We had a program in place there that goes for 30 years. The asset returns to the Victorians. What they've done is extend the tolling period in order that Transurban can build some of this other infrastructure. Where are they going to get the infrastructure built? They're going offshore, and now a lot of it, as I say, is underwater in terms of time and cost. So what does that leave for the rest of the society? Well, time will tell. Yes, who's next?
Look, I think we've got time for one more question, Jeff. We've got to keep this on the road, so we'll make this a final question.
Yep.
Hi, Jeff. In response to economic recovery, one of the most important things is generally infrastructure, and a lot of money gets put into that, which I'm sure everyone will be quite comfortable with in here. What do you think are some of the other things that could be done to boost economic recovery that perhaps are not being done in a time of change?
You're right about infrastructure, but for those of you who are municipalities outside of metropolitan cities, you know how difficult it is to compete for getting people even to tender for works, let alone to be able to tender at things that you can afford. So there is a massive skewing of where money is being spent at the moment towards metropolitan cities as opposed to provincial, rural, etc. And that is going to be very, very costly in the years to come. And that's happening at a time when we're seeing more and more people leaving the cities, because now that we can do Zoom calls, etc., we can work from home. People realise you don't have to be in the cities, you don't have to spend 20 minutes, an hour every day travelling to and from work. So they're moving out. So the pressure on so many of these rural provincial councils is only going to grow. And that's not where government is focused at the moment. Government is focused on the East Coast. So please understand, when you say infrastructure, it's infrastructure in metropolitan cities. The other area that I think, and it's always the most important, when people ask me what was the most important thing we did in government, it was restore confidence back in community, restore pride. So when we came to office, what was the capital of Victoria? About $2 was a big joke all around the country, right? By the end of it, people were jumping. People were coming back to Victoria because they saw this is where the excitement was. It wasn't just a matter of infrastructure, it was a matter of putting together programs like our major events, which involved both sports and the arts. It was giving people hope. It was giving them excitement. we've got to get back to the place where we rebuild confidence. And that's got to come in part from the top. It's not about always trying to say the right thing all the time to protect your ass. Sometimes you've got to be out there. You've got to say things that stir the juices, right? You've got to do, when I say funny things, you've got to live. Life's, we only get a short time on earth, and you've got to live it every day. So I think the sad thing at the moment, some of you may remember a film called On the Beach with Ava Gardner, which was filmed in Victoria many, many years ago and down at Eliza. And there was grass blowing down the main streets. It was deserted. Well, that's the city of Melbourne at the moment. It is awful. I don't think it'll rebound to the point where it was before COVID for 20 years. Because even some of the big employers are moving out of town. So that whole bubble, and I don't know if it's occurring the same in other cities, because I haven't travelled to other cities except to Tassie last week. So we've got to rebuild confidence, and that's not just about infrastructure. So you just take the closure of the borders and what it's meant to universities. Half our life was around young people coming into Australia, learning, manning our shops, buying things, accommodation, food. There is no buzz right now. Maybe that's understandable. But how do you return that buzz? How do you rebuild confidence? So that would be my answer to your question. Confidence. No, Carlton, that was the last question, right? Bottom of the ladder. Can I wish you all well in your deliberations? I leave you with the one message. The most important thing you should be taking away, hopefully over the next few days, is asking the question, how good is my own health? What is my priority? And if you can provide leadership on that to your family, your workplace, colleagues, community, we'll all be a lot better off. Thank you. Have a great few days.